Hello and welcome to episode 30 of Airs for Architecture with me, Ambrose Gillick. I'm speaking today with Alastair Parvin, architect, writer and CEO of Open Systems Lab, about his and their work as an R&D lab working on open digital innovation concerned with social, economic and environmental challenges. We speak about three pieces he's recently written: a new land contract, planning for the future, and we need new operating systems. Whose job is that? All freely available on his Medium page.
So yeah, basically we can kind of put planning back the right way around again. So I sometimes describe this as putting democracy upstream of the market instead of downstream of the market. So this will invariably, you get a sort of strange thing. Even on the left, you get a kind of small c conservatism where people are kind of like clinging to the existing system and saying, oh, it's undemocratic. No, the current system is incredibly undemocratic. It's not about having less democracy. It's actually about putting the democracy bit first. So we have a public, open civic discourse about the places that we want.
A is for architecture.
A podcast about
Buildings, architecture, urban culture,
and
space.
hello and welcome again to Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Alastair Parvin. Alastair, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, yeah, I'm Alastair Parvin, and I trained as an architect. I don't think I'm an architect now, but I think what we're doing is architecture in a way. I'm the founder of a company called Open Systems Lab, and we're a non-profit R&D lab, which is a really stupid thing to be, by the way. And
why is it a stupid thing to
be? Working on a whole bunch of problems related to the built environment.
So how does an open systems lab, how does it operate? What does it do? I mean, is it a think tank?
Yeah, and very much not a think tank. That's a really interesting question. So I think probably
a tank?
Yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, no, fewer tanks. I don't know what kind of tank we would be. I think so. We're essentially we use design thinking. We're designers, and it's a big mix of people in the team, which includes software engineers and designers and researchers and all sorts. Mm-hmm. But we are doing design. But I would say what we're doing is we're kind of applying design not to buildings themselves. What we design are not buildings themselves, but rather the systems through which buildings are made. So if you like, the kind of invisible layer of systems, ways of doing that lie behind architecture and lie behind the built environment. And that was, for me, that, very much kind of the way in the whole genesis was recognizing that actually that's the bit where design was needed. Is actually when you look at the huge kind of massive crises, social, economic, environmental, that we were facing, architecture, not only was it not helping, but often it is pointed in exactly the opposite direction. And actually that's not architects' fault, right? It's because actually, if you like, underneath architecture, underneath the built environment are a set of operating systems, and they're all pretty much obsolete. And so the question is, whose job is it to kind of redesign those operating systems? So how we construct, how we design, how we do planning, how we, the business models, if you like, that shape our buildings and shape our built environment. They are designed, and if they were designed, they can be redesigned. To quote the late David Graeber, the open secret of the world is that it is designed. And it could just as easily be designed differently. But the question is whose job is it to redesign those systems, to imagine how they could be different? Yeah. And generally speaking, it's a kind of job that falls through the crack in the sofa, because the state broadly thinks it's the market's job, and the market thinks that it's the state's job, and so no one really does it. So we find ourselves facing 21st century problems, but using 20th century ways of operating. So that's the sort of brief that we set ourselves, and then we would kind of work backwards and said, right, what kind of company would that be, and how should we operate?
So where did this come from? So you obviously trained in architecture at Sheffield, and then you went and worked in practice. I mean, you worked for some leading practices, didn't you? And then you set up an architecture practice, and this is the product of that. This is the natural evolution of that.
Sort of. So when I worked, so obviously midway through my education, I went and worked in practice, and I was very fortunate to go and work for Richard Rogers, another late great figure, and just a completely brilliant and lovely person, human being as well. And so I worked for 2 years at what was Richard Rogers Partnership and became Rogers Stirk Harbour. And it was really interesting because it was the boom time, right? So
this is early 2000s.
Yeah, so early 2000s, sort of 2005 era, and there was just so much money flushing through the system, and yet the buildings that were being turned out across the industry were just terrible, right? And so it was really interesting because a lot of my friends were kind of getting really annoyed by this and say, why is it? Why does the bloody client keep asking us to make the ceilings lower and take the balconies off? I mean, all architects have worked on this, and a lot of people left architecture because they got so fed up with it. And I was like, well, guys, this is fascinating. It means we don't really understand the economics of our own profession, the economics behind how the built environment was made. So when I went back to do my master's, I then spent a lot of time thinking about this, and so I wrote a kind of what's it called, like a master's dissertation thing called Form Follows Finance, which was all about how actually the built environment, just really think about this, how actually the built environment is shaped by the business model of developers and capital, basically, and that actually form doesn't follow function or anything else. Form follows finance is the actual base rule, and if you understand how the economics of the built environment work, you can pretty much predict most architecture. You can, if you understand the business model, you can predict what will come out the other end. And that was fine, but it's obviously a little bit dreary just to sort of diagnose the problem. So then off the back of that, I then got really interested in, so, okay, how could we redesign it? How could, if this business model isn't doing the thing that we all want it to do, which is make beautiful, sustainable, great places, because not because we don't know how to, but because they don't have an incentive to. In fact, they have the exact opposite incentive, right? And this is the kind of great dilemma of our time, is that we all know what the challenge is, right? And we all know broadly what the solutions are. We need to be building zero carbon, zero waste homes, beautiful, warm, right? Walkable neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. We all know, and we know how to do it, and yet we're not doing it. And it's not because we don't have enough knowledge. It's not even because we don't have enough money, right? Arguably, we have a problem of too much money, right? That's what house price inflation is. It's because we've got this sort of system of broken incentives. And it's not even, by the way, because there's somehow some bad people. Like, most of the time we obsess over the idea that some particularly greedy people, and that's the reason. It's like, no, stop blaming the players and look at the game. And if you really look at the game, you realize that there's actually a really strong set of reasons and incentives why they do that. So I then began to look, well, hold on a minute, there must be other groups of people out there who are incentivized to build the best possible places that can be. And how could we change the systems? How can we change the way we develop? How can we change the way we build? How can we change the way we design to make that the new normal? So that was the kind of beginning of it. And I was very fortunate to then meet Indy Johar, who's still my kind of co-founder and friend and mentor, and of Architecture 00. And it was really interesting, by the way, because at this time, like, hardly anyone was really talking about basically these sorts of things. And I dropped in to see him speaking, and literally the first thing he said was, architecture has primarily become a tool for the creation of capital and the inflation of capital. I was like, okay, finally. Yeah. So we got talking, and now then when I graduated in 2000, night or 9, right? Which was like the worst possible time. Just you wait, by the way, guys, because there's another one coming soon.
Very soon.
Right. So if there's any architecture students listening to this, I'm afraid you may end up replicating my experience, but I hope in some ways this will be a sort of some form of hope in on the long run. That then there was this massive crash, everyone, etc. So it was pretty grim, and I was very, very lucky that 00 were like, look, we don't really have the money to hire you, but just come and try and hang out. And I was just doing odd jobs to try and earn a living, really. And I got to do a bit of research. I got 10k funding to do some research, etc. So that was all good. And then eventually they did have some money, so I started working with Architecture 00. And at that point, so I was continuing with all this work and thinking about how we can redesign the economics behind architecture and behind development, this thing called the right to build.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel a little bit like a lot of my I'm just sort of just following these obsessions, really, and pulling on the string and seeing where it leads, right? And then another kind of a real kind of obsession of mine and others, and this is true of others working at 00, particularly Nick, is throughout the early 2000s when I'd been at university, it had also been the time when open source software was really exploding. And so I've been really, really interested in this, and interested in that's the same pattern, that same change could also potentially transform the way that buildings happen. So that led kind of by accident to us experimenting with a project called WikiHouse, and we sort of started that with 00. And then basically that sort of, we explored lots sorts of interesting projects looking at this sort of taking this much more strategic approach to design. And then eventually 2014 we said no, we should probably spin this out into its own thing. So that's actually where Open Systems Lab came from. It's a non-profit thing that span out of 00, to say, actually, let's make an environment where we can develop these ideas and actually then try and turn them into prototypes, then turn them into prototypes into real things and take them out to the world.
I see. So you do actually do building work alongside the policy.
No, absolutely. And so the way that we work is we sort of really become obsessed with a system and a problem. And then we begin to develop a vision of how that could be different. And we go, right, okay, what's the smallest possible prototype or the first smallest piece of that future thing that we could build now? And the basic trick of change is that you can persuade people all you like, but truthfully, no one's listening. They're all busy, right? So the trick is to make a kind of Trojan horse, but it's not a Trojan horse full of scary Greek soldiers. It's a Trojan horse full of hopefully a more hopeful version of what the future could look like. And then try and make it easier and more attractive than the current option. So, for me, one of my guiding mantras is that great Buckminster Fuller quote about if you want to change something, don't fight against the existing reality. Create a new system that makes the old one obsolete. And you make it obsolete by making it better, faster, more convenient. And the web is an amazing tool for us to do that, right? This is the cool thing, is that our generation has the World Wide Web. It's the single greatest invention of our time, and it allows us to kind of to make things better and easier by orders of magnitude. Now, sure, Silicon Valley has used that opportunity just to kind of make itself incredibly rich, or make a bunch of investors incredibly rich. But if you look at, say, take something like Uber, right? Uber has become utterly, it's eaten the taxi industry. How did it do that? Okay, a bit by using data, and later on by some pretty questionable competition practices maybe. But essentially, originally, it did it by just making it much, much more convenient, right? And that's just some lines of code, right? It's just using the World Wide Web. It's like, well, we can use those same tools to also make other stuff better and more convenient. And so that's our kind of way in.
The Uber's a really good example because it's not only easier for the consumer, but it's easier for the supplier as well. So
Right.
anybody through as you say, a few lines of code could, to all intents and purposes, become a self-supporting taxi driver.
Right, but this is not to say that technology is some kind of magic bullet, because the whole point of these problems are difficult because they're systemic. They're these tangled knots of this and the reason that now when you really delve into any given system, you often find that there is no single bad guy. Right, there's a bunch of people all doing stuff which individually in isolation is totally understandable, and yet when you step back and look at the collective effect, it's catastrophic. And that's kind of where we're at. So the trick is to say, well, wait a minute, if we've got a common vision of how this system could be better, what's the smallest first part of that system that we can start building now and try and earn a living from? I
mean, reading through the articles that you texted to me from your Medium, what is that? A blog? No, article.
I don't really know what it is.
Yeah, they're too long for blog. I mean, you've got one there that's 31-minute read. No, that's not.
Yeah, no one's. It's never intended for reading. It was just me. I'm amazed if you've managed to get to the end.
I read all of them.
Some kind of prize. It was just therapy. It's very cheap therapy for me.
No, but it is a really interesting. So the thing that's jumped out at me was, so they're about, again, this idea of the need. And you're right, it's patently obvious that there's an incredible need for systemic change. And as your article, which you wrote in 2021, early 2021, we need new operating systems, points out, COVID peeled back. It didn't do anything new. It just simply peeled back and showed us a very, very screwed up reality. And it's like, and the way that you describe it, and the other one, planning for the future and a new land contract, those two articles, they feel very much like you are articulating what Garrett Hardin was articulating in the 60s about what he called the tragedy of the commons. This idea that we have systems in place which ensure resource depletion, which in this case looks like declining urban quality, declining architectural quality, the gobbling up of greenbelt land, the gobbling up of rural land, the urban sprawl, and then even in city centres, the production of useless high-rise buildings, which operate as Indy Joe has said, simply to produce capital value for investors, without any kind of consideration.
And this was what I was, dawned on me and became incredibly obvious when I was looking at all this, the stuff leading up to Form Follows Finance, was this point of most of what architects were calling quotes bad design was actually really good design, but for a different economic outcome. Because what most people look at those and they say, if you ask them, what's that? Oh, it's houses. No, it's not. The de facto economic purpose of that thing there is a financial asset. So it's a really badly designed house, but it's a really well-designed financial asset. If your job is to capture the uplift in land values that happen when we give our collective consent for planning permission for development through planning permission, is exactly what their business model is. It's there's a chap called Chris Cook who rather brilliantly summarizes as the 4Bs business model, which is buy, borrow, build, and bugger off.
They're doing, I mean, where I live, they're doing a lot of that at the moment, where there doesn't seem to be any meaningful control, and that kind of, so we have this problem with the built environment, both at the scale of architecture, which is, I think, the way that we teach it anyway, is about objects, it's about buildings.
Which it never really was, right?
Which isn't a good idea.
No, it's not a good idea. Like Cedric Price said, in the end, the ultimate purpose of architecture is preventative health. In the end, you drill it all the way down. That's what it is.
And you touch on that in one of your things. Do you want to unpack that a little bit?
Well, an interesting take on this is because obviously at various points during my career, and I'm sure you've encountered this, I'm sure other people listening to this who've explored this issue of trying to take the way that you think as a designer, and applying it not just to objects and buildings, but to systems and processes. At some point, there'll always be someone who says, well, that's not architecture, right? Now, of course, the easy answer is, well, I don't care. If it's useful, I don't care. But the more nuanced, there was actually a really interesting nuanced answer here, which is if you go back to the original founding charter of the Royal Institute of British Architects in, oh God, I can't remember the year now, but Google it. Effectively, it's a piece of paper from the King, or possibly the Prince of Wales, he was at that point, I'm not sure, saying to this learned institution of men, that here's a quid pro quo, which is, I grant to you the protection, the title architect, but in exchange, you have a public duty, a public responsibility. That was the quid pro quo. And the public duty is broadly, it doesn't say it in these exact words, but if you read it, it's old language, but essentially what it's saying is this. One is you have a public duty to knowledge related to the built environment. So that is to do with teaching and knowledge is a whole bigger conversation. It's not just to do with teaching, and really thinking about what the web means for knowledge and the future of knowledge is a huge topic that we're fascinated in. But and it also says essentially, effectively, because broadly the built environment is important. So it confers upon this newly created profession, this newly created discipline, it confers on it essentially a public duty for society in the built environment. Now, what's really interesting is what it doesn't mention. It does not mention that the way they should do that is by designing buildings. It does not mention that the way they should do that is designing buildings by doing drawings for rich people. It does not mention anything to do with the business model. All it says is you have a public duty to society in the built environment. And that I think is really, really interesting, because essentially what you're saying is, right, no, it's your job, architects, it is your civic duty, if you wish to call yourself architects, to actually get to the bottom of how to help society flourish and succeed in the built environment.
Yeah.
Whatever that means, whatever it takes.
But you're right, we already know what it means, and they knew what it meant back then. I think that's the thing, that this model of education and then architectural production that we pursue, I don't know if it's intentionally designed, but it certainly seems to obscure that social responsibility. I think perhaps the way to put it is it makes it less likely to occur.
Yeah, it gives you a bunch of other sort of slightly weird, it distracts you with a bunch of other sort of strange incentives.
Yeah.
Actually, when you speak to most young, I'm sure you've encountered this, when you speak to a lot of students coming into architecture, actually they are really, really concerned with the fact that of architecture's role in climate collapse, for example. Right. So you can take even the most basic piece of that, right? It's, generally accepted. Buildings are responsible for about 39% of all carbon emissions. 28% of those are operational, so in use carbon emissions. 11% is embodied, right? So that's just the emissions from the manufacturing and the production process, the construction process of buildings, right? Now, we can get that down to zero. We can actually get it down to less than zero by building in sustainable timber. And we know how to do that, but it's not happening. And it's not happening because of a bunch of incentives in the construction system, in the planning system, to do with the way that the land system works. It's also going to be a massive big challenge in terms of how we scale up forestry industries and stuff like that. That I would, in my experience, you're more likely to have a really articulate conversation about that with someone who's only just started out architectural education or is several years out of architectural education. And that's weird.
Yeah, for sure. But it is, one of the things I was thinking about, and I've been thinking about it for a while, I read this, I can't find the book again, but I was reading about permaculture and architecture. It was a book somewhere in the library in the university, and it mentioned Hannah Arendt talking about design as this peculiar thing that sits somewhere between mathematics and art, as an actually distinct sort of psychosocial state that is required for design. But
the notion that design is a profession is utterly absurd. Design is a human function, right?
And everything actually relies on it. I mean, this is this strange thing that we've done, is that we seem to have removed this notion. So we'll come back to this Open Systems Lab and your thinking around that, but we've kind of removed design from everyday reality. It's something that people with, you know, hipster tattoos and an undercut and a fixie bike do on MacBook Pros. And
I have a MacBook Pro, if that's any help. I mean, I haven't got a fixie wheel bike or any tattoos.
But actually, if you think about the successful, say for example, a successful scientist, I am convinced that were there an ethnography done of the process of science production, what they would find is that great science is the consequence of great design, because a scientist has to design an experiment.
That's an interesting point, by the way. It's a really good TED talk about this from years ago. I was actually, weirdly, I was there in the room when he gave it. Clay Shirky gave a really good talk about this, about the origins of scientists, because most scientists the word science was quite a late invention. And it was designed in response to the printing press. And they had this whole problem of, right, what do we do with knowledge now? Because now anybody can print anything. So how do we have some knowledge that something is true? And so they invented the peer-reviewed journal. And it was only when they invented the peer-reviewed journal that people started they created these institutions, a bit like the architecture thing. And they started calling themselves scientists and talking about this thing called the scientific method. And exactly as you say, that's the essence of science, is this adherence to the method of, we're interested in truth and experimentation.
But it's the design of the experiment itself is actually a creative activity. And the notion of design and creativity, which are these intrinsically human, and I'm not saying solely human, I don't know, and I don't care, but certainly intrinsically human things. And if you look at the way that the world actually works, architects kind of deride DIY and people who do domestic work on their own. But the fact is, it's a massive industry.
If you're deriding people doing it on their own, you're an idiot. I mean, it's because it happens. It's like, I don't believe in that. Well, good luck. Like, I don't believe in oxygen.
But actually, people are enormously creative in their domestic environments. There's enormous embodied creativity.
And here's the thing, though, is that when you start to go back to my, favorite hobby horse again, we all agree that we should be building low energy buildings, really well insulated buildings, right? Anyone disagree with that? No one really disagrees with that. Who are the only people who have a direct incentive to put more insulation in the walls? It's the people who are going to pay the heating bills, right, for the next 20 years. And yet that's the one group of people who have almost no power in the current kind of system. And architecture as a profession has learned how to work. It's grown up learning to work for that system. So that's really why, when you hear architects sort of supposedly deriding, DIY or whatever, it's just because they're sort of captured by that. Actually, the much more interesting question is, oh, wait a minute, that lot is the one group of people who've got an incentive to do the very thing that we all want them to do. And so the next thing that those skeptic architects will say is, oh yeah, but they'll do it badly. It's like, well, okay, so how can we design ways where they can't do it badly? How can we make it easier for them, more convenient for them, right? And so if you take a project like, WikiHouse, which isn't that necessarily, by the way, but obviously the purpose of WikiHouse is to make it as easy as we can possibly make it to build a zero carbon house, basically. And the trick that we're doing there is we're looking at how you encode that knowledge into a computer file that then goes into a cutter, so you can just slot it together. And the term, this is brilliant. Not only is there nothing new under the sun, but most of our ideas come from traditional kind of vernacular space, right? So and there's this wonderful concept called poka-yoke from Japan. I never know if I'm pronouncing it right, but it's brilliant, which is called mistake proofing. And we're all familiar with this. Every time you use a plug socket, that's why you can't put a plug socket in the wrong way around. It won't let you, right? So and that's exactly what you're doing, right? So you say, well, actually, okay, cool. So how can we make it easier? And then it's so powerful, because at that point, you don't need to write, okay, I'm guilty, I've written long essays. But the great thing is, when you make a thing like WikiHouse, you don't need to write a long essay. You just put it in people's hands and they immediately get it. And actually, suddenly you have a flip situation, because, you can't say to your friend, hey, could you come and help me build a house for 4 weeks? That's like, I kind of got a job and kids, I'm busy, right? But you could say, look, could you come for the weekend and we'll get it built in a weekend? Like, oh, cool, that's better than what I planned anyway. And then one step further than that, you might start worrying, oh, wait a minute, my friend's an absolute idiot. I'm not going to trust my friend to build my house. But suddenly it doesn't matter, because all they have to do is slot the thing together. There is no wrong. It's either together or it's not together. And so we can do the hard work to lower those thresholds of difficulty, to change who has power in the system.
Yeah.
And that's only one tiny little tiny little applied example, but the same principle.
But it's so I mentioned Garrett Hardin and Eleanor Ostrom, who, an economist, because a lot of your thinking seems to me to have its roots, or at least it's getting some of its energy out of economics thinking, because economics is the basis for what we're playing at in the architecture. And she won the Nobel Prize for her work around common pool resources, which was challenging Hardin, and she being a much more
and I'm very much in Ostrom's camp.
I went to Pizza Express with her.
Good Lord, that is an amazing, that's a great name drop sort of celebrity moment.
Oh, it was an amazing, she was lovely. Anyway, but it was her work around co-production that your work brought to mind. So this idea of open systems and is something to do with democratizing the built environment. Democratizing that's the sort of secret idea behind a lot of it. Yeah, it's not just the means of production, like you're talking about here in terms of getting a friend over to help you build your house, but also the way that it can be conceptualized by lay people, ordinary people.
And the very definition of wealth, right? So beyond Ostrom, also sort of much later on, I sort of found my way to reading Henry George. It's the most important economist most people have never heard of.
Tell me a bit about Henry George.
Other than possibly Eleanor Ostrom, again, who's just, if we actually acted on her work, the world would look very differently.
But it's this idea in Ostrom's work, and this idea of co-production that I got the quote up actually whilst in advance of it. She said that they need to, what was it? The technologies. This is point number one. So she comes up with these four in this paper from 1996, Crossing Great Divide. She comes up with these 4 points. And she says the point number one, that these don't ensure co-production, but they make it more likely.
They create fertile territory.
Yeah. She says the technologies in use must generate a complementary production possibility frontier rather than merely a substitutive one. So when she's talking, so obviously she's talking about the production of common goods, which in general, we're talking about health, education, policing, that kind of thing. But it is totally applicable to architectural thinking, where you have to redesign. And this is where WikiHouse is kind of genius, is it's trying to redesign, it's trying to re-vernacularize not just the method of production, but also the planning. So that's a kind of
Well, it's actually we're actually working on 4 projects at the moment in the stack. We sometimes describe ourselves as like a rabbit digging our way down the stack of the built environment, each time hitting a deeper layer and going, oh, let's redesign that. So and there's one that is about planning, which I won't go on about now. But that's it's nice of you to see that, and that's I fully agree that is essentially the sort of common pattern or the overarching agenda behind a lot of the stuff that we're doing. The key word in that as well is complementary, because that's also a tactical thing about when you see that the world is so systemically screwed, it can be very, very depressing. because you're like, how are we going to turn that around? And yet the thing about these broken systems is that they will keep generating, they will keep collapsing, right? And they will keep creating more and more chaos, more incoherence. People will be sitting, working with them in them in these incredible sense of inner torn, this inner dichotomy where privately they disagree with what they have to do professionally, and they're desperately looking for some way out, because it's taking them such effort to justify to themselves the work that that they're doing, etc. Although humans, we can justify anything to ourselves pretty much, but the
guilty.
Yeah, exactly, we all do it. But the key thing is this trick of trying to be complementary, to say, right, let's create a small kernel of a new system within the existing one that is more attractive and more coherent than the old one. So I sometimes call this the lifeboat model. Is rather than trying to sink and torpedo the old ship, you just build a new ship alongside and invite people to come over when they're ready. And you accept that to begin with, you're only going to get 5 people. But then 5 people is going to turn to 50 people, and 50 people is going to turn to 500 people, and so forth. So that's it's all, the complementary thing is a tactical thing, is to say, right, and then how do you create legal frameworks around the commons that you're creating? So an obvious example of that literally is the IP, Creative Commons. That's why it's wikihouse.cc. It's using Creative Commons licenses, and that was a beautiful example. Another one of my heroes, Larry Lessig, was one of the people behind that. They've created a new form of doing intellectual property that can exist alongside and slowly replace the old dead form.
But that's, funnily enough, you mentioned legal frameworks. That's Eleanor Ostrom's point number 2. So this comes back to this idea of the complexity of the systems that you're looking at. So I do want to touch on this idea of planning, because I think it's absolutely critical, because architecture can't be understood outside the planning system, and the planning system can't be understood outside the legal system, and the legal system outside the economic system. That strikes me as being a kind of strata of what's going on.
Absolutely right.
But with this idea of planning, so that you've written quite a lot and quite wonderful stuff on it. I guess I'd like you to a little bit sort of explain what you see as being the central problem with planning, because I've talked to some other people on this podcast who've dealt with ideas around planning, and they have their own different prescriptions of what the problem is and how it might be resolved. But I'd be quite interested in what yours.
So the important thing to kind of know about the planning system is sort of, well, there's planning and there's the planning system, and they're not quite the same thing, of course. But it's helpful to know where it came from. Well, I won't go into now about land value and land rights, which is really for me the bottom of the stack. But effectively, the idea behind planning is this incredibly beautiful and sensible one, which is to say that it should space belongs to all of us, right? What you do in space has implications for everyone else. So therefore, the way that we develop in space should be coordinated, right, in some sort of way, and it should, and the force doing that coordination should be what's essentially in the long-term common good, not just in one. And again, this is a commons thing. Like, one person shouldn't be allowed to just screw it for everyone else, because that way lies, tragedy and disaster.
But likewise, everybody doing small kind of crappy acts shouldn't be allowed to.
Exactly. So in fact, the roots of the kind of early planning system and things like the Garden Cities movement, they originally also, planning was conceived as primarily a public health situation. So once you had cities emerging and people just popping up stuff anywhere, well, sanitation became a big issue, right? So people would just put out their sewage or whatever, and that became a huge sanitation issue. So someone said, well, wait a minute, we should have some kind of coordination, but also we should have some sort of way that planning is coordinated, so we can collectively put into a central pot to pay for the sewage infrastructure and all the other kinds of civic infrastructure. So we can essentially take this coordinated approach to development. So essentially, the root idea of planning and I'm amazed we don't recognize its magnitude in terms of the third layer of democracy, really, in terms of the sort of central government elections, local government elections. And planning is the most everyday form of democracy imaginable, in the sense that it is where lots and lots of power and contested things play out. And it's based on this very, very beautiful democratic idea that development should be in the common interest and shaped by all of us. So so that's the amazing thing. Now, the issue is, of course, that the planning system that we have today was designed before the computers or the internet, right? Mm-hmm. So its operating system is basically paper and documents. And so they had this problem of, well, how do we do it? And we have this very weird thing where it said essentially that operating system has shaped the way we've ended up doing it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we haven't really changed it since. Like, okay, the paper now is moved to PDFs, but fundamentally the underlying sort of dynamic of the operating system hasn't changed that much. Mm-hmm. So we say, right, we can't deal with all this complexity. So all the knowledge will be in these contests will have to go through these sorts of referees. And the way I describe planning today is a bit like, so basically the way they do it is like, before you do anything, you have to ask permission, right? And I would say, imagine a game of football where there are no rules, but the referee, you have to ask the referee before you kick the ball every time, right? Pretty quickly, it would be A, mayhem, B, it would become highly corrupted and inconsistent. The pressure on the referees would be utterly impossible. Mm-hmm. And it would become highly reactive, mm-hmm. right? In fact, and this is the paradox of where we've arrived at with the planning system today, is most of what goes on in our planning system is actually not planning. It's development control. Mm-hmm. It's reactionary, not proactive, which is really, really weird. So if you ask a child how you think planning should work, it would be, we all come together, we collectively decide what sort of places that we want, we set the rules for that, and then we just get on and do it. And that's not how it works, right? We allow sort of people to make propositions, and then everybody reacts, and most people react against, because they're like, why should you win when I'm going to lose? Or you know, and of course, the fact that also this is done through this incredibly paper-based bureaucratic process is incredibly inaccessible unless you've got lots of time, lots of money, and lots of knowledge, which is a structurally undemocratic thing. Right? Mm-hmm. It's very, very hard to participate in the planning system successfully unless you have a lot of time and a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And that is a really obvious form of everyday undemocracy. Mm-hmm. So the question we should ask ourselves is, how can we take the principles of planning and the kind of, how would we do them again now if we were going to make a planning system today in the 21st century, given that the web exists, basically, mm-hmm. computers and the web exist. And what we would try to do is turn it back the right way around again. So we would have a discourse which is about, right, here are the things that we could do. And here's, based on all the data and all the knowledge that's out there in the world somewhere right now, here's what we think the impact of that would be. So if you build that there, here's what the impact on public health will be. Mm-hmm. And you don't always have to know why these patterns are going to work or not work. You know, one of my favorite planning rules is the fact that you can't make a fast food takeaway within 400 meters of a school. Why 400 meters? Oh, it's just arbitrary, but actually it's got proven beneficial health outcomes. So good, there we are, evidence matched to a pattern. So we could have this democratic discourse in a much, much simpler way about sort of, okay, what type of development do we want? And what's the quid pro quo, right? Actually, we want this community infrastructure, we want these schools, we want these GPs, et cetera, et cetera. And then it's not negotiable. Then the land values have to adjust for that expectation. Instead of our current system, where effectively the developer comes in, they have this ability to negotiate down all the quality of their development and the amount of community infrastructure contribution they're going to make, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, they own all the cards. They have all the cards in negotiations. So invariably, they win the negotiation. And so they essentially kind of drive down the kind of quality, which of course has this circular sort of hideous effect, because it means that all development is really, really terrible. Therefore, people are against new development. Therefore, it's really hard to get development. So, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trapped in this cycle where there's more and more pressure on local authorities to approve schemes, but it's harder and harder for them to do, et cetera, et cetera. So, and we just end up in this spiral to the bottom. So, sorry, I got distracted there, back into the old system. But the new system say, well, actually, let's decide what kind of places we want, and let's encode those rules. And those rules can be incredibly nuanced. We are not talking about the kind of ham-fisted sort of blunt zoning that you see in your kind of SimCity thing, where you're like industrial zone. No, right? You can be much more pattern-driven, much more nuanced, and say, actually, even to the point of having design codes if you want to, right? So we can say, right, these are the heights. You can even set window proportions if you really want to. Generally better to do what I would call performance-based planning. So again, to pick an example of why planning is really about public health, but it's in the use classes for a long time, and it's still, I think this is technically the case, I think it's actually held up. Leather tanning had its own use class. I can't remember which it is, one of the B's. Now, why? Why does leather tanning have its own use class? Well, the reason is because they use, probably do still use a urea, and the smell is dreadful. So really what's being used there is a blunt proxy for air pollution. But these days, actually, we don't need the blunt proxy. We could just talk about air pollution. So we could just say, well, look, we'll put, sensors or whatever it is. Don't do anything here that produces this many, more than this parts per million of X. Excuse me, I must get a drink.
Get a drink.
Just one moment.
Oh,
apologies, so I'm going to mess with your recording here.
It's fine. I can edit it out.
You can edit this bit out. There we go. Sorry about that. So yeah, like basically, we can kind of put planning back the right way around again. So I sometimes describe this as putting democracy upstream of the market instead of downstream of the market. So this will invariably, you get the sort of strange thing, even on the left, you get a kind of small c conservatism, where people are kind of like clinging to the existing system and saying, oh, it's undemocratic. No, the current system is incredibly undemocratic. It's not about having less democracy. It's actually about putting the democracy bit first. So we have a public, open civic discourse about the places that we want. And the way that land values work, without getting incredibly boring on you, is that land is determined by the law of rent. So in other words, land, the amount that you pay for land is the amount left over after you say, right, I could build, say, a house worth, £250,000. Let's say it's going to take me £150,000 to build that house. Then the value of the land left behind is £100,000. But if you pass a law saying, oh, I'm afraid actually you've got to make that house better, so now you're going to have to spend £200,000 to build that house. Now the land value absorbs that cost. So now the land value will be £50,000, right? So now actually so it's good for democracy, it's good for citizens because it puts them in a position of genuine power. And this is why most people are just sort of utterly fed up with sort of and mistrust democratic institutions, because I think we got used to, particularly during that kind of new Labour period and onwards, we got used to this idea of consultation. I always say consultation is a bit like being asked what colour brick you want to be hit over the head with. And people are not idiots, so they instinctively understand that whatever they say, it's not really going to change the underlying economic outcomes of what's going on, because they don't really have power. So this is a way of saying, no, let's give communities actual power. The answer is not, less democracy, it's more democracy. And then set clearer rules for people downstream. And actually, certainty is a good thing. So weirdly, it's good for communities. It's actually good for businesses as well, because they're not dealing, it takes away a whole form of uncertainty.
That's really interesting. Your point about being hit over the head with a brick reminds me of my old pal, Lee Ivett, used to say that participation or consultation or charrettes, there are means to implicate poor people in the dreadful things you're about to do to them.
Yeah, there's truth in that, right? So the counter of that, and I'm always holding this up, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I hold it up as just an amazingly exciting vision of how urbanism could be done differently, is Almere in the Netherlands, which I imagine you're probably familiar with, lots of people are familiar with, where what the municipality did is say, well, instead of selling this land off to developers, what we're going to do is divvy it up into small plots, put in the roads, put in the pipes, put in the infrastructure, sell those plots directly to families, and for a price that pays for all that infrastructure, and etc., and pays for all those schools. Says, here you are, here's your service plot. Now you might say, well, okay, but getting through the planning system is really difficult. No, don't worry, they've already done it. So when you get your plot, you get a plot passport, which has got essentially a design code on it that says, right, here are the rules. Your house can be this high, whatever. The rules can be anything you want. And obviously, I think they should be things like it must be zero carbon, et cetera, et cetera. Get on with it. And as long as you don't want, if you want to deviate from those rules, sure, put in a planning permission. But if you're happy with those rules, and in 80 or 90% of the cases you are, we don't need to hear from you. You don't need to get involved in all the expensive bureaucracy. Just get on with it. So to kind of, there's lots of different ways that we're interested in how that could be brought about. But one practical way that we saw was this thing that at the one of the things at the core of this shift was the format of information. That today information in the planning system exists in these big reports that have to be written by consultants and read by officers. By the way, if you actually speak to officers about this, say, look, 80% of it is just rubbish. It's regurged nonsense. And the policy documents are all like blurry stuff like so-and-so must be considered. What does that mean, right? It's basically, I'll know it when I see it. Right? It's all rubbish. So we said, wouldn't it be cool? How can we make it easier to do the web? So we're working on this open source tool called PlanX. And the idea is to allow make planning information much more nuanced, but also much more accessible. So the first this is just the tip of the iceberg, but the first little starter service running in PlanX is a service called Find Out If You Need Planning Permission. And it does exactly what you say it says on the tin. You can go in, you just enter your address. It says, right, according to us, this is a terraced house, like yours maybe. What would you like to do? And you tell it what you'd like to do. It asks you a series of questions, pulling on every piece of obscure bit of legislation or case law that might apply to that project. It says, right, based on what you've said, that yes, you need planning permission, or no, you don't need planning permission. And here's why. Here's the link back to the original piece of legislation if you really want to drill all the way in. And you can do that in about 5 minutes without hiring a single planning consultant.
Yeah.
And so
it's a really interesting idea. I mean, that what this process, this system that you're devising, but at the level of the house and at the level of the city, at the level of the urban, sort of starts to reorientate. So we started this conversation, you talking about housing being essentially a tool of economics. That's its meaning. And it's its meaning to not only the planning department, the housing developers, but also to the residents themselves. So you look at a house and you say, this is going to acquire value, good schools, good roads, bit of greenery near a hospital. And that's the judgment that people are making when they're buying houses which are evidently terrible. I mean, that sounds a bit harsh, but I think that comes into it. I mean, it came into my decision about buying a house. You look at it and you think, is this a smart place to buy? But what you're proposing seems to me to be flipping this around and making the built environment a tool of democratization. So rather than the result of democracy, this becomes a mechanism for making democracy more likely to occur.
Yeah, and I would argue, and I don't want to get too kind of lost in here, but this kind of brings us to our fourth project, which is called Fairhold, where we're exploring whether it's possible to design a new form of land ownership. And I would argue that the built environment is the original form of democracy in the form of land, because actually housing is not an economic tool, right? Housing is actually a political tool. I read a book recently that said, what is money? The question, what is money, is a completely stupid stoner question, except that it's still interesting in the morning. And it's the same for the question, what is ownership? Right? What is ownership?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really weird question, isn't it? Well, the answer is it's a piece of paper. And the origins of that piece of paper essentially go back to the feudal system.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's conferring power, right? And so land ownership is and always has been the structure of power. So as I would often put it, like it was created because of medieval king problems, which is like first world problems, but more extreme. And medieval king problems was, how do I rule over a population and fund my armies without paying for standing armies, right? Essentially, because they're really expensive and have a habit of turning on you. And the answer in this country, of course, perfected by William the Conqueror, was these pieces of paper that said, if you grant to these lords, if you if you bring soldiers when I ask for them, I will grant you your own private fiefdom in which you can raise taxes on people. And those taxes are rent, right? So it's a form of power. And so you had this sort of power hierarchy of lords, and we still call them landlords. It's really weird. It's there hidden in plain sight, this idea that you can buy the right to extract taxes out of people. And it's not a pejorative, by the way. I've been a landlord. It's just, this is the weird system that we're in. And then you have these sorts of tenants, and then over time you have these people say, no, this rent is oppressive. I want to buy my freedom from rent. And of course that's where freehold comes from. So the free in freehold isn't free as in no money, it's free as in liberty, right? Mm-hmm. So what you're doing is essentially buying your freedom from rent. And that's why, when you see one of these mortgage adverts where the couple is sort of dangling some keys and pouring some champagne, what they're celebrating is not just that they've bought that particular house. They're celebrating the fact that they've essentially just leveled up in class in their minds, because they've entered this ownership class, has bought its own freedom. So, and if you look back through the history of democracy, the history of the vote and the reform, it's all tied to land. It's the relationship between the landowners and the landless. So one of my favorite examples of this is a village called, I think it was called Old Sarum. I have to Google it. It was like this deserted village somewhere, I don't know, Wiltshire, somewhere in Britain. And it was completely deserted, but for some accident of history, it returned an MP. And so if you owned that piece of land, what you could do is invite your mates to get to sign on to the electoral register, and they would elect you. And lo and behold, you had a seat in Parliament. And so the value of that land was like £70,000, which back in the 1700s was a colossal amount of money, right? So because effectively you were buying power, and that's what land ownership is. It's a form of power, right? So the ultimate form of democracy is this idea, it is free, like to own your own home, right? To kind of be free from rent, to have that kind of liberty, to have security of tenure, so no one can throw you out of your house and make your kids move school just because they decided to, right? That's the ultimate sort of democracy project in a way, for the built environment. So I would say the kind of bottom of that, you're right in terms of we're really, really interested in that idea of democratization, but the bottom of that stack is your own kind of economic role and security in society. And of course, we all know that property and your relationship to where you live is the basic unit. It's not just the basic economic unit; it's the basic unit of kind of freedom, really, and being able to participate as a citizen in society. But I should say, the democratization thing, in a sense, it's an end. It is an end, but it's not really, because it's also a means. Right, because this is not like some kind of mad political project, because if you sort of look at the huge systemic crises that we face, like climate change, for example, there's sort of two schools of thought. There's the one that says, oh, right, we've got to go full kind of China on this, where you kind of subvert all democracy and you force it on people. But actually, when you really embed in these systems, you realize the exact opposite is true, that the solution, most of the time, the solution to these challenges is more, not less democracy. Right. So I often talk about the idea that if you look, the word democracy it comes from the Greek demos, kratos, people, power. Now we think of it in terms of the vote, right? But it could be any form of power. It could be literally electrical power. So a quote democratic power grid, a power system, is a power grid in which every house has solar panels on its roof, right? It's not necessarily the most efficient way to generate power, but it is the most effective. Yeah. So and actually a really, really great way of solving these big systemic crises. So it's not like the democratization thing is just a kind of an agenda. It's actually it's usually the best way to get from where we are to where we all agree we need to be.
Yeah. How do architects operate in an open source scenario? Like, what becomes of their elite knowledge? What becomes of their authority?
Architects already operate in an open source scenario in the sense that hands up if you own the IP on the stair or the screw or the brick. Hands
Somebody's just put
hands
their
up
hand
if you've never right, exactly. Hands up if you've never read Detail magazine.
Oh.
Open source, I always think it's really funny when people are sort of saying, oh, open source is somehow radical and how you can earn a living. Because I'm like, dude, like architecture is not doing great right now on earning a living.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much irrelevant. It's responsible for a tiny percentage of buildings globally. And even that, it has very little agency. But B, architecture is already open source. There's nothing radical about open source in architecture. Actually, architecture is quite interesting. It never really fully made it into this slightly odd world where you can own sort of things. Intellectual property is a whole other strange world. So the key thing, though, that so as I say, is like what architecture sells is primarily a service. So people don't buy recipes, they buy cakes, right? So, and I think this literally happened in lockdown. I think, was it Mr. Kipling and KFC? They literally gave away their recipes. And then no one said, oh, wait a minute, you're going to give away the house. It's like, no, people don't want to make, if they wanted to make their own cakes, they could have made their own cakes.
Yeah.
But the real thing that architects have to ask themselves is, how do I provide a better service to more people?
Yeah.
And so, like, I also, by the way, I have lots of ideas. I won't bore you with them now about what the future of about a million ideas of how you could make money, right? In this kind of future. But like the most basic fundamental thing is, look at what lies ahead. We have got to build millions of homes. We've got to build massive cities, completely zero carbon cities all over the world, but especially in the continent of Africa. They're going to need to know how to do it because they've got massive population curves coming up, right? Do you know how many zero carbon cities there are in the world today? None. So the challenge that lies ahead makes landing on the moon look like a total doddle, right? Nothing in the history of humanity has come even close to the challenge that we are going to have to achieve to transform the way we build, to transform the way we do food, all sorts of stuff, right? We're going to have to really, really redesign. And we can do it, by the way, all the knowledge and technology, most of it's already here. So this is a colossal challenge on a scale of which we've never seen before. The notion that you are somehow going to be unemployed, this notion that we're going to somehow run out of stuff that needs doing, is so utterly absurd that it's just laughable. And if you're asking that question, I kind of feel sorry for you, because I think you're looking at the future completely the wrong way around. Like, the actual thing is, oh my God, where are we going to find all the people we need to take on all these jobs? So the future does not contain selling the same service over and over and over and over again to only rich people. But the good news is that there are like billions of people out there who need your knowledge, and you've got to find a way to get it to them.
That's brilliant. We'll stop there. Fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Al.
It's my pleasure. And so thanks for tolerating me going off on one.
Oh, it was really, really good.
Well, wasn't that lots of fun? Thanks to Al for recording this with me rather late in the evening, and for his generosity with his ideas. You can read the articles we spoke about via the links in the podcast description, where you can also find more videos of Alastair speaking. Do go and see him live if you get the chance. He's a force of nature. And don't forget to like, subscribe, follow and share. Ears for Architecture, everywhere. Cheers.